At 5:58 in the morning, while most of Flores Island was still asleep, the ground exploded. Not slowly, not with a warning. It happened in an instant. A magnitude 7.7 earthquake, one of the most powerful to hit this region in decades, ripped open the seafloor just 68 kilometers off the northern coast and sent shock waves tearing through the earth at thousands of miles an hour. Buildings cracked roofs, collapsed mid-sentence. People were thrown from their beds onto floors that would not stop moving. And within minutes before the dust had even settled, a government alert was screaming at every coastal community for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Get away from the water right now. Do not wait. This happened this morning, August 15th, 2026, Indonesia, and it is still unfolding. Stay with me, because this is one of the most significant earthquakes to strike Indonesia in years. And the full picture of what happened and what it means is something every single person watching this needs to understand. Let's start with the raw science of what hit Flores Island this morning, because the numbers are genuinely shocking. The USGS, the United States Geological Survey, the agency that monitors seismic activity globally, registered this quake at magnitude 7.7. That is not a number that gets thrown around casually. To understand what 7.7 means, you have to understand that the magnitude scale is logarithmic. A 7.7 is not slightly bigger than a 7. It releases roughly 5 times the energy of a 7 point when about 30 times the energy of a 6.7. It is the kind of earthquake that fundamentally changes landscapes. It liquefies the ground beneath ports. It collapses bridges. It drops buildings that were standing for decades into rubble in under 60 seconds. The depth of this earthquake was recorded at just 10 kilometers below the seafloor. That is critically important. Shallow earthquakes, anything under 70 kilometers, are the most dangerous category. The energy has less distance to travel before it reaches the surface, which means the shaking is more intense, more sudden, and more destructive at the point of impact. This was not a deep rumble that gradually faded. This was a shallow, violent rupture that hit the surface of the earth like a hammer. The epicenter sat about 68 kilometers north and northwest of the city of Enda in East Nusa Tenggara province. It struck right in the Flores Sea off the northern coast of Flores Island, a location that earthquake scientists have watched with concern for a very long time. And the reason they watch it is something called the Flores back arc thrust. This is a fault system that runs along the north coast of the Lesser Sunda Islands, formed by the relentless collision of the Indo-Australian plate, grinding underneath the Eurasian plate at a rate of 80 millimeters per year. This is not a minor geological feature. This is one of the most geologically stressed zones on the entire planet. The same fault system produced one of Indonesia's worst historical disasters, the 1992 Flores earthquake, also magnitude 7.7, also in the same stretch of coastline. That quake killed more than 2,500 people, with roughly half of those deaths caused not by the shaking itself, but by the tsunami that followed within minutes. 26-meter waves, that is over 85 feet, swept through coastal villages before people even had a chance to run. This morning, the world woke up to a repeat of that geological scenario. Same fault, same island, same magnitude. The immediate aftermath was captured in real time through emergency broadcasts, local media, and witness accounts, and what they describe as organized chaos in the best sense of the word. People running sirens, going off entire neighborhoods, evacuating toward higher ground in the dark hours of the early morning. Indonesia's National Disaster Management Agency, BNPB, was the first to confirm deaths. 2 people, a man and a woman, died at the Elsa Mamir port. That port is in Mamir, which is one of the largest cities on Flores Island, with a population of nearly 8,000 people, and a city that has lived with the trauma of a similar earthquake before. In 1992, Mamare was devastated. The seafront was wiped out, buildings collapsed. Locals there have passed down the stories of that day for over 30 years, and this morning those people woke up to shaking that felt like history repeating. At the port, where the earthquake damage was severe, at least 1 additional person was reported injured. Local media footage circulating online showed extensive damage to buildings across the Malam area, with structural damage visible along the waterfront and through the downtown core. In Rautan, in the Manggarai region, further west on Flores, AFP photographers captured images of damaged houses. Walls cracked apart, ceilings pulled down, debris filling what used to be rooms and family homes. The most dramatic eyewitness account to emerge in the immediate hours came from a seminary. Students at St. Peter Major Seminary in Sika, a place known locally as Rita Pirit Seminary, on the predominantly Catholic island of Flores, were in the middle of morning mass when the earthquake struck. The rector, Reverend Gedelis Tanga, described the scene. Students and nuns ran out in panic as the roof of an assembly hall began collapsing above them. At least 1 priest suffered a broken leg, not from debris falling on him, but from jumping from the 2nd floor of a building to escape during the quake. Think about that for a moment. A priest in the middle of morning mass making the split-second decision to jump from a second-floor window because the building was coming apart around him. That is the violence of a 7.7 earthquake. That is what 10 kilometers of depth and a shallow seafloor rupture does to a structure built on land. The USGS published shaking estimates that frame the scale of how many people were affected. Around 5,600 people are estimated to have experienced what seismologists classify as severe shaking. Approximately 4,200 people felt what is rated as very strong shaking. More than 1 million people felt strong shaking. Several million more across a much wider area felt moderate to strong ground motion, and the shaking was felt across an enormous geographic reach. In Makassar, the major city in South Siloé, about 400 kilometers northwest of the epicenter residents, felt the earthquake strongly with the shaking lasting for 2 full minutes, 2 minutes of shaking. If you have never experienced that, it is almost impossible to describe how long that actually feels. It feels like it will never stop. Indonesia's National Meteorology and Geophysics Agency, BMKG, moved immediately. Within minutes of the earthquake, they issued a tsunami warning covering coastlines across East Nusa Tenggara, West Nusa Tenggara, South Sulawesi, and Southeast Sulawesi. That is, 4 provinces put under tsunami alert simultaneously. 22 areas in total were placed under what BMKG described as alert status. The estimated arrival times for potential tsunami waves range from roughly 4 minutes after the quake to about an hour, and 40 minutes later for more distant coastlines, a window of uncertainty that makes the warning system absolutely critical. BNPB official Abdul Muari went on local broadcaster Compass TV and delivered an urgent message directly to coastal residents. He told them to move more than 2 kilometers inland or to climb to ground at least 10 meters above sea level. He did not mince words. He said, "Move away from the shore. Carry out self-evacuation immediately." The language of disaster officials is almost always measured and careful, and when they start using words like immediately, you listen. Now here is where the story takes a significant turn that matters for context. Tsunami waves were recorded. BMKG confirmed that tsunami waves under 1 meter in height reached several areas along the affected coastlines under 1 meter. That is the recorded height of what actually arrived on shore. And after the history of this region, after what happened in 1992, after what happened in Palu in 2018, where a tsunami killed thousands, the fact that those waves measured under a meter is something that deserves to be acknowledged plainly. The tsunami warning was eventually lifted. Australia's Tsunami Warning Centre confirmed no threat to the Australian mainland or territories. The Pacific-wide catastrophe scenario did not materialize. But here is what you need to sit with for a moment. The fact that the tsunami was relatively small does not mean the danger was not real. It does not mean the warning was wrong. It does not mean people were wrong to run. The difference between a small tsunami and a catastrophic one can come down to the specific geometry of the fault rupture, the angle of the seafloor displacement, the direction of wave propagation, and a dozen other factors that scientists can only calculate after the fact. The warning was issued based on what was known in real time. A 7.7 earthquake shallow-depth tsunami generating fault, and the correct response was to evacuate immediately. That response saved lives, and the situation is not over. By 2228 UTC, just 30 minutes after the main quake, seismologists had already recorded 3 significant aftershocks. The first measured magnitude 5.9, the second was 5.6. The third, and this is the one that commands attention, reached magnitude 6.1. A 6.1 aftershock is not a small event. In most of the world, a 6.1 earthquake would be the main story of the day. It is large enough to collapse already weakened structures, to trigger new landslides in areas the main quake has destabilized, to send tsunami alert systems back to high alert. When a 7.7 main shock is followed by a 6.1 aftershock 30 minutes later, the danger is not over. The danger is ongoing. Local authorities confirmed they were continuing to monitor the situation and assess the risk of further aftershocks in the hours ahead. In earthquake, science aftershocks follow predictable statistical patterns in terms of frequency, but not in terms of size or exact timing. For the next days and weeks, the people of Flores Island will be living under the shadow of this event. Every tremor, a potential signal that something larger is still to come. The USGS issued what they call a yellow alert for shaking-related fatalities and economic losses. Under their classification system, a yellow alert means some casualties and damage are possible, and the impact is expected to be relatively localized, requiring a local or regional level response. That alert level matters for how international aid and resources are mobilized. It tells governments and NOSs what to prepare for, and it begins the chain of response that will determine how quickly affected communities receive support. The assessment of vulnerable building stock in the region adds another layer of concern. The USGS noted that the population in this region resides predominantly in structures that are vulnerable to earthquake shaking, specifically unreinforced brick with concrete floors and precast concrete frames with wall construction. These are building types that perform poorly in significant earthquakes. They do not flex, they break, and when they break, they collapse suddenly. The USGS also flagged that recent earthquakes in this area have caused secondary hazards including tsunamis and landslides, both of which remain potential threats in the aftermath of today's event, especially given the mountainous terrain of Flores Island, where rainfall or further seismic activity could trigger hillside instability in areas already weakened by this morning's shaking. Now, I want to zoom out and explain why Flores, specifically why this island, this fault, this stretch of ocean keeps appearing in the history of major earthquakes. Indonesia sits at one of the most geologically complex intersections on Earth. The archipelago, a nation of more than 270 million people, spread across roughly 17000 islands, sits at the collision point of three major tectonic plates, the Eurasian Plate, the Pacific Plate, and the Indo-Australian Plate. The entire country sits within the Pacific Ring of Fire, the horseshoe-shaped zone of intense seismic and volcanic activity that encircles the Pacific Ocean and accounts for roughly 90% of the world's earthquakes. Indonesia does not just sit in the Ring of Fire. It sits at one of the most complex and active sections of the entire system. Flores Island specifically is shaped by the Flores Back Arc Thrust Fault, which runs east-west along the north side of the island. This fault is formed by the subduction of the Indo-Australian Plate beneath the Eurasian Plate. The two plates are converging at 80 millimeters per year. That sounds small, but over geological time, it builds tremendous stress, and when that stress releases, it releases catastrophically. The eastern segment of this fault famously ruptured in the 1992 earthquake. Scientists have long noted that the western segment has remained locked, storing energy, and that today's earthquake occurred in the western portion of the system. That 1992 earthquake is the benchmark that every scientist and every Flores resident carries with them. Same magnitude, same fault region, and a death toll that reached as high as 2500 with waves that crested at 26 m. Nearly 9 stories high in some locations along the coast. The communities closest to the epicenter were essentially erased. Entire villages on small offshore islands were completely swept away by the tsunami surge. It remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in Indonesian history. The people of Flores Island have lived with that memory. They have built it into the way they teach their children the way coastal communities are organized. The evacuation drills that emergency managers try to maintain. And when the ground shook this morning, the same magnitude, the same fault, the same coastline, those people did not wait for someone to tell them what to do. They moved. That is the single most important factor in why the early death toll from this earthquake is 2 and not 200 and potentially not 2000. The institutional memory of 1992, the BMKG warning system that issued alerts within minutes, the community response that sent people moving toward higher ground in the dark before the sun had even risen. Emergency preparedness does not eliminate earthquakes. It cannot stop the ground from shaking, but it can be the difference between a tragedy and a catastrophe. The BMKG itself has been significantly upgraded since 2004, the year the Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami killed nearly 230000 people across 14 countries, including over 160000 in Indonesia alone. That event forced a complete rethinking of how Indonesia monitors, warns, and responds to seismic and tsunami threats. The current warning system is faster, more comprehensive, and better connected to local emergency managers than anything that existed before 2004. Today's rapid warning issuance, with estimated tsunami arrival times calculated and distributed across 4 provinces within minutes of the quake, is a direct product of that transformation. And still, the situation demands sober attention as it continues to develop. 2 people are confirmed dead, with damage reported across multiple areas of Flores Island. The port at Momare has sustained visible structural damage. Buildings in Rutung have been damaged or destroyed. A priest jumped from a second-floor window at a seminary in Sika. Aftershocks continue to rattle the island and surrounding seas. And tens of thousands of people who evacuated coastal areas this morning are waiting right now as this script is being written for official word that it is safe to return. Some of them will go back to their homes and find damage. Some will find nothing left. The process of assessing the full extent of destruction across a mountainous island with difficult road access will take days' access to remote coastal villages where the shaking was worst, and where tsunami waves may have reached shore. Those assessments require boats, helicopters, and ground teams that are just now being organized and deployed. The broader picture matters too. Indonesia has experienced multiple significant earthquakes already in 2026. In April, a magnitude 7.3 to 7.4 4 earthquakes struck the North Maluku area, killing 1 person, damaging over 450 structures, and generating a 75 centimeters tsunami. In February, a smaller quake in Pachatan, East Java, killed 1 person and injured 47 others. Each of these events is a reminder that the Ring of Fire operates on its own schedule, indifferent to human plans and preparations. What you are watching right now, this earthquake, this tsunami, warning, these evacuations, these collapsed buildings, is not a random event. It is the predictable consequence of Indonesia's location on one of the most seismically active fault systems on Earth. Scientists have been pointing at the floor's back arc thrust for years, noting its locked western segment, noting its proximity to dense coastal populations, noting the history of what happened the last time a 7.7 magnitude rupture occurred along this coastline. The earthquake happened. The only variables were timing and response. The timing, by definition, could not be controlled. The response, the warnings, the evacuations, the institutional preparations, those could be, and they were. That matters. It does not erase the loss of the 2 people killed at the Port of Mare. It does not repair the broken homes in Routing and the shattered assembly hall at Rita Pure Seminary. It does not undo the terror of 500,000 people experiencing severe ground shaking in the pre-dawn hours of a Saturday morning. But it almost certainly prevented a death toll that in 1992, with the same magnitude earthquake, reached into the thousands. As of right now, Indonesia is in active response mode. BNPB is coordinating disaster assessment teams. Local officials are managing evacuation centers and monitoring aftershock activity. The PMKG continues to track seismic signals across the region. And on Flores Island, the people who have lived through this kind of event before and the people experiencing it for the first time are beginning the long process of figuring out what comes next. If you are watching this and you want to understand what you can do, the most important thing right now is awareness. Indonesia's disaster response capacity depends significantly on international attention and support. Organizations like the Indonesian Red Cross, known as PMI, and international partners like CARE, Save the Children, and the UN's Disaster Coordination Office, OCHA, are already beginning to assess needs. As the situation develops over the next 48 to 72 hours, the needs of affected communities will become clearer, and that is when support matters most. This is a breaking story. The numbers will change. The damage assessment will grow as teams reach more areas. The aftershock situation will evolve. The full human cost of this earthquake is not yet known. What is known is this: a 7.7 magnitude earthquake struck the Flores region of Indonesia at 5:58 this morning. It was shallow. It was violent. It generated a tsunami warning across 4 provinces. It killed at least 2 people and injured others at Momir Port. It damaged buildings across multiple areas of Flores Island. It sent hundreds of thousands of people running for higher ground in the dark, and it ruptured along a fault that last produced this same scenario in 1992 when 2,500 people died. The world is watching, and Flores Island is still shaking. If this video found you informed, if you now understand what happened, why it happened, and why it matters, please share it. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of stories like this as they develop. And keep Flores Island in your thoughts today, because the people there are going through something that words can only partially capture. We will keep tracking this story and bring you updates as they come in. Before I let you go, I want to talk about something that does not get enough coverage: the human experience of living through a major earthquake. Not the seismology, not the policy, just what it feels like to be on Flores Island on a morning like this. Indonesia is not a country that treats earthquakes as abstract events. This is a country where the phrase "ring of fire" is not a metaphor or a geological curiosity. It is the lived reality of daily life for hundreds of millions of people. Every Indonesian child grows up knowing in some form that the ground beneath their feet is not stable. School earthquake drills are common in high risk zones. The vocabulary of disaster evacuation routes, safe assembly points, tsunami inundation maps is embedded in community planning in a way that most countries in more geologically stable parts of the world simply do not have. Flores Island in particular carries an unusually heavy burden of seismic memory. The 1992 earthquake is not distant history there. It is family history. It is the story a grandmother tells about losing her sister. It is the scar on the landscape where a village used to stand before the tsunami came. It is the reason certain communities were rebuilt on higher ground after the disaster, and the reason certain coastal areas were never resettled. The geography of survival in Flores is shaped by 1992 in ways that are still visible today. And so, when the ground shook this morning at 558, the response was not simply fear. It was fear layered on top of memory. It was muscle memory kicking in before the conscious mind had finished processing what was happening. Get out. Get to high ground. Do not go toward the water, because in Flores, that lesson was paid for in thousands of lives. That kind of communal knowledge is hard to measure, but it almost certainly saved lives today. When BMK issued its tsunami warning, when Abdul Muwari appeared on television urging people to move 2 kilometers inland or 10 mi up, he was not talking to a population that needed to be convinced. He was reinforcing something those people already knew in their bones. That is what preparedness looks like in practice. Not the glossy version where everything is orderly and controlled. The real version, people running in the dark without shoes, grabbing their children, not knowing if the wave is already on its way. And yet doing the right thing anyway because the community knowledge passed down through generations told them exactly what to do. There's also the question of what happens in the days and weeks after the initial emergency passes. Earthquake aftershocks can continue for months. A 6.1 aftershock struck within 30 minutes of today's main event, and while that specific aftershock caused no additional confirmed fatalities, the psychological weight of living through aftershocks is real and significant. Every tremor becomes a question. Is this the next big one? Every creaking building becomes a potential threat. People who cannot return to damaged homes sleep in cars in open fields and emergency shelters. Livestock are lost. Crops are damaged. Local economies already fragile in many rural parts of Flores are disrupted by road damage, bridge collapses, and the displacement of workers and farmers. The port at Malra, where the 2 deaths were confirmed, is not just a symbol of tragedy, it is an economic artery. Flores Island is connected to the wider Indonesian archipelago, primarily by sea-fies, fishing boats, commercial cargo. When a port sustains serious structural damage from a major earthquake, the ripple effects touch everything from food supply to medical access to the movement of rescue and response teams. Assessing and repairing that infrastructure is not a background task. It is frontline emergency work. And then there is Mare itself, a city that has already been through this. In 1992, Momare was described as badly damaged by reporting at the time. Buildings collapsed, the waterfront was destroyed, thousands of residents lost everything, the city rebuilt slowly over years, and now it has absorbed another major seismic event on the same fault with the same magnitude, and it is going to have to assess the damage and rebuild again. The resilience that represents is real. The exhaustion that comes with it is also real. Indonesia's government has well-established disaster response mechanisms. The BNPB, the BMKG, the Indonesian Red Cross local emergency management offices at the provincial and district level. These systems were built in the painful aftermath of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami and have been refined through dozens of subsequent disasters, including the 2006 Yogyakarta earthquake, the 2009 Padang earthquake, the 2018 Lombok and Palu earthquakes, and many others. Each event has been a lesson, and each lesson has shaped the response capacity that was deployed this morning. But resources are always finite, and the ongoing question in Indonesia, as in every country that sits on the ring of fire, is whether the pace of preparedness improvements can keep up with the pace of seismic events, whether early warning systems can reach the most remote coastal communities before the waves do, whether buildings can be retrofitted or replaced before the next major rupture, whether the institutional knowledge that drives good earthquake response can be maintained across changes in government budget cycles and competing national priorities. These are not abstract policy questions. They are the questions that determine whether an earthquake like today's kills 2 people or 2000 today. The answer is 2. And that number, for all the damage, all the fear, all the homes to be assessed, reflects a warning system that worked, a community that responded, and decades of hard-learned lessons applied in the critical window between the first shake, the first wave, that is the Indonesia earthquake of August 15, 2026, a magnitude 7.7 strike on one of the world's most dangerous fault lines, a tsunami warning across 4 provinces, buildings damaged from Mallory to Rutan, a seminary where morning mass became a survival situation, 500,000 people who felt severe shaking, and at least 2 lives lost, with that number subject to change as teams reach more of the affected areas. Keep watching, keep sharing, and keep your eyes on Flores.